Hello, preteen families. Today, for this meditation snack, we are actually going to read a story. At Halloween time for the past 3 years, we have been reading the story of Angulimala from this book, Buddhist Tales. And you will see why once we get going. And then I'll do a little talk about it at the end. Angulimala the Brigand. Thousands of years ago, in the land of India, there was a prosperous kingdom called Kosala. The king's name was Prasenajit, and his palace was in the glittering city of Shavasti, which was full of splendid shops, beautiful parks, and magnificent mansions. All was well and happy in the kingdom of Kosala until a terrible blight fell upon it. It was not the usual kind of catastrophe, a flood, famine, plague, or war. Rather, it was caused by one man, a fearsome brigand whose name was Angulimala, which means finger necklace. This is because he had made a vow to kill 1,000 people, and to keep count, he saved a finger from each of his victims and wore it on a cord around his neck. No one could stop Angulimala. The king's men could never catch him because he could run faster than the fastest horse, and he was tremendously strong and very clever. Once a party of 40 men on horseback went out to catch him, and he killed them all and strung their fingers on his necklace. Whole villages in the countryside became empty, as all the people took refuge in the city out of fear of Angulimala. No one went out of doors at night for fear of Angulimala, and even during the day, people stayed far, far away from that part of the country where he lived. Now at a time, it so happened that the great teacher called the Buddha, whose name means the Awakened One, was also living in Kosala near the city of Shavasti. He was called the Awakened One because he had awakened from all the hopes and fears that torment human beings and keep them lost in a kind of dream. When they are happy, they hope to be happier and are afraid to lose the happiness they have. When they are unhappy, they fear they will remain that way. They blame other people for their problems and somehow hope to get out of them that way. But the Buddha had awakened from all that. He was content to be just as he was. The Buddha lived as a monk without any money or possessions. Every morning after he had spent some time sitting calmly and peacefully without thinking about anything, which is called meditating, he would walk into the city of Shavasti to beg for his morning meal, his only meal of the day. He would start at the end of a street and go around the back of each house to the kitchen door and stand there with his begging bowl without saying anything. India is a very hot country, so people kept their kitchen doors open. They would see the monk standing at the door, and if they had any extra food, they would put some in his bowl. Everyone knew the Buddha was an awakened person, so when people saw him, they felt honored that he had come to their house. And he usually didn't have much trouble collecting a bowl full of food. One particular morning, as he was on his begging round in Sravasti, he heard people complaining bitterly about Angulimala. They said that a great number of people were going to King Prasenajit's palace to demand that the king take his army and go out and catch the fearsome, invincible brigand. After hearing this, the Buddha carried his bowl of food back to his sleeping place, ate quickly, and put his things in order. Then he set out along the road that led to where Angulimala lived. As he walked along, the Buddha met people coming in the other direction. "Do not go that way, monk," they told him. "Angulimala lives down there. Anybody who goes in that direction is sure to get killed." The Buddha listened politely to what they said, but then continued on his way in silence. At first there was quite a few passers-by going in the opposite direction who gave the Buddha this warning. But the closer he got to Angulimala's lair, the fewer people were on the road. At last, except for him, the road was completely deserted. The Buddha continued walking quietly along. Up the hill in the forest, Angulimala saw the Buddha coming. How amazing, he thought the brigand. He can't have heard of me. People don't dare come this close, even in groups of 100 armed men. And here comes this unarmed monk all by himself. Wonderful. In a few minutes, I shall have another finger for my necklace, and with hardly any trouble at all." So saying, the brigand picked up his bow and arrows and buckled on his sword. Swiftly and nimbly he ran down through the trees. Without making a sound, he came out on the road a short distance behind the Buddha. Then a strange thing happened. Angulimala couldn't catch up with the Buddha. As we know, Angulimala was a very fast runner, faster than a horse or a deer, but no matter how fast and long he ran, the Buddha was always just out of reach. And the strangest thing was that the Buddha himself was not running at all. He was just walking along at his normal pace. Angulimala could not understand this, and he became more and more furious at being unable to get his hands on the Buddha. He ran and ran, panting and sweating, panting and sweating. He ran until at last he could run no more. Then he stopped in his tracks and shouted at the Buddha, "Stop, monk, stop, stop." The Buddha kept walking quietly along, but now the amazing thing was that although the brigand had stopped completely, the distance between them grew no greater. "I have stopped," said the Buddha, turning his head to look at the brigand in the eye. "Now you should stop too." "What do you mean by that?" shouted the infuriated brigand, who thought things were just the other way around. "I've stopped living in dreams of hope and fear, and so I've stopped hating and harming others. So instead of being stuck as you are, I can move just as I please. Now listen, Angulimala, if you want to be able to go as you like, as I can, you should stop now. Stop too." When Angulimala heard those words and looked at the Buddha, who was gazing at him kindly from just beyond his reach, walking calmly along without getting any further away, suddenly he realized how stupidly wrong he'd been all these years. He wished with all his heart that he'd never done harm to anyone. He took off his weapons and threw them in the ditch. Then he fell on his knees and asked the Buddha to help him. "You can come along with me and be a monk," said the Buddha. "I'll teach you how to meditate. Keep your heart open the way it is now, and everything will be just fine." So the Buddha walked back into Sharasti with Angulimala walking humbly at his heels. They went to the Jeta Grove, a park in the city where the Buddha often stayed with his followers. Not long after they got there, King Prasenajit arrived with 500 soldiers. "We're going after Angulimala," said the king, "but I'm afraid we're going to have a difficult time, so I have come to ask your advice." "Good," said the Buddha. "Why don't you sit down and have a cup of tea and we'll talk about it." The king was anxious to seek the Buddha's help, so he sat down near him on the ground. The Buddha beckoned to Angulimala, who had by now changed his clothes and was wearing a simple monk's robe. He took him to one side and spoke to him softly, and so when the water was ready, following the instructions the Buddha had just given him, the once fearsome brigand, Angulimala, served the Buddha and the king tea. "What would you do," said the Buddha to the king as they spied their tea, "if you discovered that Angulimala had become a simple monk, without possessions, devoted to a life of meditation and doing good for others?" "To begin with, I'd be really amazed," said the king. "But if it really happened, I suppose I would pardon him and treat him with the respect due to a monk." "Good," said the Buddha, "because that is Angulimala who has served you tea." The king jumped up, white with fear and anger. But the Buddha soothed him, explaining that Angulimala had really changed and no one need be afraid of him anymore. After that, he had a few minutes to get used to the new situation. The king let go of his bad feelings and began to feel really quite pleased. Then he took leave of the Buddha, explaining that he had other things to do. He and his army all went home. Angulimala became a very eager follower of the Buddha and spent a lot of time in the forest meditating according to his master's instructions. As sometimes happens to people who meditate a lot, after a while he began to develop special abilities which he used to help other people. Angulimala seemed to have a special talent for helping mothers give birth to their children. Whenever there was a problem with a birth, Angulimala was always called. It seemed he only had to be there for everything to go smoothly. So although many people remembered his bad deeds of earlier days and turned away from him when he was on his begging rounds, there were always enough grateful mothers or mothers-to-be, and Angulimala usually received enough to eat so he could go back to the forest and meditate. But when anyone has done as much evil as Angulimala had, killing all those people, there are bound to be bad results. After a few years, when the former brigand went to the city to beg, he began to have accidents. If a flower pot fell off a windowsill, it would hit Angulimala. If anywhere near him someone was beating an animal, somehow the blows landed on Angulimala. If someone threw a stone at someone else in anger, it hit Angulimala. Anytime one person used a weapon on another, instead of hitting the intended person, it hit Angulimala. And it got worse and worse. Finally, bruised and broken and only half alive, Angulimala dragged himself to the Buddha and begged him for help and advice. The Buddha told him, "Young man, gather your courage and hold out for a while longer. Though you may not think so, this is the very best thing that could be happening. All those murders you committed had to be paid for. If you had not changed your ways, you would have been reborn again and again and experienced terrible punishments in all your future lives. But since you have worked so hard to make your heart pure and have done so much to help other people, all your bad deeds are ripening now. If you can stand it just a little longer, it will be over. Your debt will be paid." So Angulimala took heart, and he endured the painful accidents a while longer. Gradually they happened less and less, and finally stopped altogether. Angulimala went on meditating in the forest and giving his help whenever it was needed to mothers in childbirth. He lived a long time and came to be admired and even loved by the very people who once hated and feared him. Gradually, like the Buddha, he awoke entirely from his dream of hope and fear and became completely fearless and wholly contented. So that was our Halloween story of Angulimala. Do you see why we used him as our Halloween story? And if you remembered that story from last year or the year before, what do you think? Do you notice different things as you read it? And what is that you notice? What has changed about the story this year compared to last year? And it is an unusual ending for a Halloween story. Usually the monster doesn't end up making up for his wrongdoings. And I wonder what you think about that. So thank you for watching. And we're going to end with this. I'm awesome. You're awesome. And we are awesome.